Gwen, you have so captured the essence, the ethos of CFDM Northwest. Thank you. I'm Mark Cutchall. I'm a board member with CFDM and a spiritual director. And all of us are so glad that you can join us from around the Puget Sound area and beyond here. Before I introduce our presenter, I want to just make mention of the chat feature, the chat function at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question as the next few minutes unfold for you, you can use that to type in your question, and that will really invigorate our Q&A that follows. I'm delighted to introduce our presenter, Susan S. Phillips. Susan is an experienced spiritual director. She's a very popular teacher on the contemplative Christian life. She's a gifted author. Her book, Candlelight, Illuminating the Art of Spiritual Direction, is on the reading list front and center for CFDM's direction program. And she's also written the book, The Cultivated Life, From Ceaseless Striving to Receiving Joy. Which of us wouldn't want that? And oh, by the way, on top of all of that, she's executive director of New College Berkeley, an affiliate of Berkeley's Graduate Theological Union in the Bay Area. I invite you now to settle in and listen for how story, scripture, and the turbulent times we're living in right now come together in exquisite darkness, discovering the gift in our crisis today. Susan, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's such a delight to be here with all of you. What an exquisite ministry Terry and Gwen are leading along with some of the rest of you, and I very much appreciated that time of prayer that Gwen led us in. So tonight, it's my honor to share with you some of my reflections on gifts I've discovered during the past 14 or so months. During this pandemic season, I have been amazed to see that contemplative times with other people have been rich and deep despite physical absence. You may have discovered this too. People have been thirsty to experience God, and contemplative times with another person have breathed life into this dispiriting season. All the spiritual direction groups I lead have taken place on Zoom, and most one-on-one direction sessions have been by phone. Embodied intimacy is missed, but interior intimacy has been augmented. Deep calls to deep in the roar of the pandemic. I've come to believe that this new intimacy is due to the vulnerability we're all experiencing during quarantine, held within the structure provided by contemplative listening and by God's all-surrounding grace. I experience this with you here now. We're not able to be together in person, but we are together in the intimacy of Zoom. We're a community of solitaries, like some monks I know who live in their own private cells in a monastery, joined in prayer, though usually separate. During the pandemic, we have been in our solitary spaces, most of us in homes, and we catch glimpses of the private, personal space of other people through the wonder of Zoom. We're more vulnerable than if we were together. We're more or less relaxed than usual. Many of us are wearing slippers on our feet. We're relaxed in part because we haven't had to drive through traffic to be together, or for some of you, fly to a different city. In this vulnerability, we're open to one another in new ways. When I've met with people for spiritual direction this year, we've been isolated and sequestered. Our social skins have thinned. We've become more sensitive and reactive, sometimes in unpleasant ways. Having a person come to my door is rattling. Where is my mask? Is the visitor sufficiently masked? The social political tumult of the past year also has left our nerves more exposed and moved many of us, those questions have moved many of us to difficult soul searching. How does racism lurk in my mind and heart? I ask. Many of us ask. How can I listen well to someone who holds political views diametrically opposed to my own? I ask. Many of us ask. There are blessings in this vulnerability, these soul-searching questions among them. Being less defended also makes it possible for us to open our hearts more deeply to the Holy One and to allow God's grace to enter into our wrestling with some of these issues. Throughout the pandemic, many people have sought closeness with God through the conversational and contemplative art of spiritual direction. I know I have. It can be a lifeline in untethered times, as it has been this year. Someone else is willing to hear us in all our vulnerability and disorientation, and that person is listening for God in our lives, trusting that God is near. I've been so grateful for my own spiritual director during this year. When our conversation begins, I can ramble for quite a few minutes before I get to where the story begins to form by God's grace. As I relax into the contemplative experience, I find there's a remarkable spaciousness, which seems even wider and deeper than when we meet together in person. Over the phone, I feel my director right next to me, in my ear, in my home. I hear her breathing. With her listening so closely, deep feelings and images stir in me and are transformed into story as I share them with her and with God, whom I trust is ever present and feels more palpably so through my director's accompaniment. People I love have died during this year. I grieve the absence of those friends and also grieve the opportunity to hug and weep with others who loved them. Enforced solitude and my greater vulnerability augment my feelings, which can be piercing. Those feelings emerge in the stories I tell to my spiritual director. Storytelling and story listening are crucial aspects of our spiritual formation. With my spiritual director, I shape the narrative of my soul, of my life. I begin to see more clearly who I am in the context of a listening relationship that acknowledges God. The Indo-European etymological root of the word narrative is na, G-N-A. It shows up in the Greek word gnostic and our English word knowledge. Narrative is knowledge. We discover who we are through stories, both stories received and stories told. Jesus was a storyteller and story listener. In Eugene Peterson's translation of Mark chapter 4, verses 33 and 34, we read, "With many stories, Jesus presented his message to them, fitting the stories to their experience and maturity. He was never without a story when he spoke. When he was alone with his disciples, he went over everything, sorting out the tangles, untying the knots." Jesus told stories and also elicited the stories of those around him, helping them to sort out tangles and discover how their stories are shaped by the presence of the Holy One, and how the Holy One's story is given in a way that matches their experience and maturity. It's a loving relationship. In Christian holy listening, we rest in the greatest story ever told, the gospel story. And we trust that God cares about the stories of every particular person. Those stories often tumble out of us mixed with emotion and paradox. They are real and true, not polished and produced. Speaking them to another person can help us sort out tangles and untie knots. We may find that our experiences of isolation and loss during the pandemic are held in the loving care of the God who loved us enough to become human and share our joys and sorrows. During the pandemic, I've listened to many honest stories about desires and griefs. One particular story lingers in my mind today. A pastor who sees me for direction has been isolated in retirement and often depressed in quarantine, all alone and feeling useless. Occasionally, the directee, who also works with a therapist, experiences an ominous darkness. In our times of spiritual direction, I try to notice the whole truth, hope and fear, faith and doubt, desire and sometimes despair. This year, that's happened in our separate solitudes, connected by faith, hope, and a telephone. One day, the directee said, "I'm enveloped in darkness. In the darkness, I find it hard to remember the ways God has been with me. In the light, I find God in scripture, nature, people, prayer. That escapes me in the dark. No sense of God. The darkness feels thick and heavy." I felt concern about the darkness, and I knew it was real. I must acknowledge and not dismiss it with a theological platitude, I thought. What I said was, the darkness can be so painfully empty. It feels like a place apart from where you have often experienced God with you in the light. It sounds as though you're wondering where God is when you're in the darkness. And then there was silence. And then I heard a whispered yes. And then more silence. I waited. And then I heard, I sense it now. It's an exquisite darkness. And I just echoed, exquisite darkness. My mind went to Isaiah 45, verse 3. I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that you may know that I, the Lord, who call you by your name, am the God of Israel. I didn't say that, but I prayed it. All I said was, exquisite darkness. The directee continued, yes, as we talk, I know that it's dark. It's still dark, but there is a kind of light. There's a sense of presence. Very moved by this, I said, even in the darkness, there's light and presence. You're not alone. The directee said, yes, I just want to hold this in silence now. In the silence, I felt close to the directee, who now was not fearful of silence and darkness. I felt close to God. The directee was courageous and honest in facing the darkness, experiencing its heaviness, and we were together in it, and God was felt. I listened to slow breathing through the phone and felt grateful.